They move it up over the line. A long pass by Mikhailov didn't work. Cleared in front of the net on the boards. And Philadelphia, two-man break again. A breakaway. Leafs going ready to goal. Goal! Beautiful goal by the Leafs. Terrific.
Pretty good job of interference run, too, by Gary Dornhofer, but Rick McLeish is an excellent shooter. Not too often, Dennis, you'll see the Soviets get caught like this. Here it comes. Watch the interference on the part of the one Flyer right there as he moves over at the line. Here's McLeish. Perfect spot.
Everybody, it's Isaiah. Just reminding you that FlyersNittyGritty.com and the O&B Puckcast are brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. Hey, do you have damage to your home? Not sure who to call? We suggest that you call Summit Public Adjusters before your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be very stressful. Let Summit take the stress out of the claims process. From storm damage to your roof, to toilet overflows, to broken pipes and fires, Summit gets you the most money for your repairs. So next time Mother Nature leaves you in need of repairs, call Summit Public Adjusters at 215-752-0560 or visit summitpublicadjusters.com. Licensed in PA and New Jersey.
And we are back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast, episode number 188. Danny Briere has gotten the Flyers off to a roaring start in the new era of Flyers hockey. Actions speak louder than words. There's no doubt about that. The Philadelphia Flyers have traded Ivan Provorov and received, I think, quite a bountiful. We'll talk about that. Let's introduce our panel before we bring on a distinguished guest. Chef to the left, B. Could be joining us. It's tough. We're recording during the daytime, but we do have with us the great Dan Silver. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. I'm doing really good. I'm excited about what yesterday portends for the future. So it's going to be. We thought it was going to be a fun off season, and it definitely looks like it's going to be.
Yeah, I think so. We'll talk more about that. Before we introduce our guests, just a reminder, the O&B Puckcast is on 12 podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, Amazon Audible, Google. We have a YouTube page. Just plug in their O&B Puckcast. We have a Facebook page. And, of course, you can follow us on Twitter at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. We have a backup plan at Getter at O&B Puckcast, at O&B Puckcast. Sometimes we get a little salty over there. And if you could follow or subscribe, whatever applies to your particular platform, to the O&B Puckcast, particularly on Spotify or Apple, it would really help us. It moves us up the charts when people are looking for Philadelphia Flyer podcasts, and we do appreciate your support. So without any further ado, let's bring on from the fourthperiod.com and TSN, what is it, 690 in Canada, Anthony DiMarco. How are you, man?
Not too bad, boys. Clearly an eventful 19, 20, 21 hours or so in Flyerland, but I think it's a more or less universally liked deal that the Flyers and new general manager Danny Briere was able to pull off here.
Yeah, let me just review the Flyers. During this transaction, they receive Cal Peterson and his $5 million salary, right-handed defenseman Sean Walker, a veteran, and his $2.65 million salary, ex-high second-round right-handed defenseman, draft pick Helge Grans, a 23 first-round draft pick that was from Los Angeles, a 24 second-round pick from the Kings, And the Blue Jackets have the option in 24 to give the Flyers their second round pick, or at the end of the first round, this is kind of weird, they can declare that they want to move it to the 2025 draft. But either way, the Flyers do get that second round pick. Columbus gets Ivan Provorov. 30% of his salary is retained by the Kings. The Kings, needing the salary relief to re-sign some of their players, take on Kevin Connaughton and Hayden Hodgson, who were recently in the AHL. And I think that sums it up. Dan, early reaction, and then we'll go to you, Anthony.
Yeah, well, first, it's great Anthony can join us because he's been breaking all these stories. I mean, he broke the Fletcher firing, the Alan McCauley hiring a few weeks in advance, or the promotion. And then yesterday, certainly one of the first people to start talking about Provorov and what the return was going to be. And also, we'll probably get into a little bit of the Carter Hart stuff, but the possibility that could happen. So kudos to Anthony for breaking all that stuff. You know, I was just the totally random thought. I was also thinking when you were going through the picks, the Flyers are going to add a second round pick from the Jay O'Brien fiasco, either this year or it sounds like it might be next year. So the Flyers could really have a lot of second round picks next year. But this was the big story for me here is that Danny Briere had no experience as an NHL general manager. They kind of were putting all their eggs in their basket with him. It's something we talked about. And the main quality he was going to have to show, which wasn't shown previously by Chuck Fletcher or Ron Hextall, was the creativity to pull off moves where he could get multiple teams involved. He could weaponize the salary cap. He could extract value. And all in one fell swoop, Danny Briere at least showed that he has the capability to do that, because that's what happened yesterday. I mean, he moved Ivan Provorov, a guy who we weren't sure exactly what the value was. He wanted to move him to Columbus. However, Columbus basically said, hey, you know what? We don't want to take his whole salary cap. So, you know, we could give you a first and second round pick, but we can't take the whole salary cap. So then Briere's like thinking to himself, okay, who might want to shed some salary? We could eat some salary. So his buddy Rob Blake, who he knew from playing days, he calls him up and they work out this third part of it where the Flyers took on $7.5 million of salary from the Kings. The Kings then retained 30% of Ivan's salary, which is about $2 million. So the Kings all told get rid of $5 million worth of salary space so they could sign, you know, Gavrikov if they want. And we get back from the Kings a second round pick and a prospect who fills a need in our prospect pool, a right-handed defenseman who was taken in the second round. So basically everyone gets what they want. Briere is the one who really seems like he orchestrated this whole thing. And he's shown us that not only are they not bullshitting us when they talk about a rebuild, because trading Provorov is a clear sign that this is a rebuild, right? He's the guy who plays the most minutes on this team. He leaves a huge hole for them to fill. So it clearly signals it's a rebuild. And Briere also shows that he has the gumption and the intelligence and the creativity to pull off trades like this. So it was a really good day for Flyers fans. That means the team's going to be worse next year, which is, you know, probably better for the rebuild. But a really good day showing the capabilities that this new GM is capable of.
Yeah. And Anthony, you talk about a factor here being the lack of big increase in the salary cap. Maybe you could expand on that, including some of your other thoughts.
Yeah, I actually think that the flat cap, for lack of better terms, $1 million increase, however you want to term it, is actually good for the Flyers. And I had heard that on Monday, and I talked about it with Jason yesterday, that it was something that was probably going to aid the Flyers on numerous fronts. One, with their RFAs in Cam York and Morgan Frost and Noah Cates, as they couldn't ask for more money. And B, I actually thought Ryan Ellis, because maybe a lot of teams, much like Vegas did last year to get out from Evgeny Dodonov and taking on Shea Weber, I was of the belief that, and I still think it could be true, that Ryan Ellis may be more appetizing for teams to take on, get that immediate cap relief on LTIR, and dump a shorter-term contract, whether that be like an Anthony Mantha or a Kyler Yamamoto, a Tyler Myers, something like that. But in the end, they were able to take on $7.5 million of salary from this deal. And I do think that if you prorate, if you get the difference, they're $1 million more over the cap or not over the cap, but they have $1 million more in salary today as opposed to yesterday, because they took on, I think it was, what's the combined salary? 7.8 between Walker and Cal Peterson.
Yeah,
so
Cal Peterson's 5 and Walker's 2.65.
2.65. So they're slightly under 1 million more than when they were paying 6.75 to Ivan Provorov. And they take advantage of this because LA wants to get out from that money to be able to sign Vladislav Gavrikov, which they're working on right now, according to Dave Pagnotta. So the LA Kings get the immediate cap relief and pay up a second round pick and Helgi Grans to do so. You get the Columbus Blue Jackets, who give up a first round pick and a second round pick for Ivan Provorov at $4.75 million, which, whether or not you think he's a good defenseman or a top pairing or not, I think 4.75 for Ivan Provorov is a really good ticket for him. And then the Flyers walk away with 3 draft picks, as former second round pick in Grans. You have Sean Walker, who, based on what I've heard, he's kind of like a Justin Braun 2019 circa type of player, like a good number 5, could plug in on your right side and on an expiring contract. So there's probably a good chance that you see Walker traded at the trade deadline this coming year for maybe a 3rd or 4th round pick. So you could potentially walk away with 4 draft picks, 3 of which being in the top 2 rounds, an additional maybe mid to later round pick, depending what happens with Walker, and a former second round pick from 3 years ago in Grans, who, as Dan said, checks the box of a right-hand shot defenseman, which they're clearly lacking in their system. And now next year, going into for the Phantoms, you have Ethan Sampson, Grans, depending what happens with Wyatt Wiley, you could potentially have 3 younger right shot defensemen playing with the Phantoms, which they've certainly lacked over the years, which is why you maybe saw them go get a guy like Belpedio last year to play alongside a Zamula or an Emile Andre. So, I mean, I really think it's a home run deal for Danny Briere. He found a way to weaponize his cap space in order to gain more assets than he would have typically gotten if it was just moving on from Ivan Provorov. And you've set yourself up nicely with a guy like Sean Walker, who I think can give you on-ice value next year. Maybe he plays earlier on in the season with a guy like Igor Zamula and could maybe net you another draft pick later on in the season towards the trade deadline.
Yeah, and not only that, with the contract like Peterson, who kind of fell out of favor after showing some promise, you can waive that contract. No one's going to take it. So they have that kind of flexibility with Peterson that they don't have with somebody like Sandstrom, if Sandstrom is even in their plans. Plus, and Dan, this is right up your alley, Helge Grans was a teammate, if I'm understanding correctly, of Emile Andre. They played on the junior team together, or was it the pro team together?
I don't know off the top of my head. Which, by the way, if you watch Danny Briere's press conference, he basically said he didn't know much at all about Helge Grans. So I know about as much about Helge Grans as Briere does. But what I did was, when they made the trade, I went over to Scott Wheeler at The Athletic, always puts together good pipeline ratings for each team. And he had Grans as the like the 5th or 6th best prospect for the Kings. And they have a really good farm system. And, so he kind of fits in as like a B type prospect of right-handed defenseman. I mean, he's very toolsy. He's 6'3". Some people have been saying, oh, he could be like a Phil Myers. I don't know if that's a negative or a positive. I guess ultimately it's a negative, but again, he fills a hole of what we need. And in terms of at least right-handed defenseman depth in the prospect pipeline, I can look up while we're talking where he played with Andre. But Andre is a guy who Briere brought up without even being asked about him specifically, about defensemen who may make an impact next season. The person asking the question specifically asked about Zamula and Adard. And in his response, Briere mentioned Zamula, Adard, and Andre, who I think is much better than either one of those defensemen. Zamula, maybe you could make an argument for, but I think Andre is going to be a really good NHLer, and he might be up next season, maybe not at the start, but who knows? So I thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, the fact that he's played with Grons is obviously can't be a negative. And so, yeah, no, it's a good move. And now it sets up for, what's coming next. There's already been a lot of smoke about different players. And look, there's a number of players now who, for various reasons, Briere is going to be potentially trying to move on from. Tony DeAngelo and Kevin Hayes are two guys that I don't know if they have positive or negative value in and of themselves, but they're probably two guys, especially Hayes, that they're going to be trying to move on from. It was kind of interesting that Hayes wasn't involved in this deal with Columbus, because maybe you would have figured that if Columbus really wanted Hayes, they would have worked it into this deal specifically. So it kind of makes me wonder, like with the new head coach, Mike Babcock in Columbus, maybe it changes their thinking about Hayes. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe Anthony might have some intel about that. But those two guys, he's probably going to be looking to move. And then the two guys who clearly have positive value, who he could be looking to move, are Carter Hart, who Anthony had tweeted about yesterday, potentially being on the move, and Travis Konechny. So, it just sets up this offseason to be kind of a really intriguing one.
Yeah, Anthony, maybe we can run down some of these names of players, and should we start with the elephant in the room and Carter Hart and what could be going down before the draft?
Yeah, so obviously, like, me and Dave Pagnotta kind of broke Twitter a bit with our Carter Hart tweets, and upon further review, I talked about with Dan a bit over text last night, is that we probably could have worded it better. Because we quite literally meant what we wrote, is that they're working on a deal for Carter Hart, but it was taken kind of as, a deal's getting finalized or whatever. But so I will take the blame on that. Probably should have worded it better. I was on the move a lot yesterday and was just trying to get out what I was told verbatim. But I do think that they're working on a deal for Carter Hart, but I do think that they're going to drag this out maybe close to the draft, because they want a haul and they want this to be an absolute slam dunk, because they know that it probably could be a tough sell to some in the fan base, given Hart's age, given how long it's taken them to find a goaltender, and whether or not you think he's an elite goaltender or an upper tier goaltender or whatever. I do think we could all agree that he is probably a bona fide starter in the NHL who has shown very high capabilities at times. I've heard that Toronto is one of the teams, and even Nick Alberga referenced this. It has shown interest in Hart, but I do think the holdup there would be getting out from Matt Murray's contract. You get the Ottawa Senators, who, in my opinion, from an on-ice standpoint, makes the most sense. They have no goaltender of the future. I don't even know if they have an NHL goaltender under contract for next year, which is crazy because they traded Philip Gustafsson for Cam Talbot. So whoops on the part of Pierre Dorion. But the problem with them is that they don't have much in the way of draft capital. I don't think they have a first-round pick or second-round pick this year. So if you're going to go down the road with the Senators, you're probably going to look at an upper-tier prospect like a Ridley Gregg or a Tyler Boucher, maybe a Lassie Thompson, Jacob Bernard-Docker to a lesser extent, and then the Montreal Canadiens. And the Canadiens are very interesting because, yes, they're in a rebuild, but they also have some younger players who are already showing high levels of play, in a Suzuki, in a Caulfield, a Caden Gooley, a Kirby Dach as well. So what would you be looking for from the Montreal Canadiens? They obviously have a 5th overall pick. They have the Panthers' first-round pick. They have some younger defensemen that could be intriguing, maybe like a Justin Barron. They also could maybe give up in a way of a second-round pick. I mean, I think that and the snag with Ottawa, I forgot to mention, is the whole ownership transition.
Yeah.
So I think that the Flyers are going to slow play this, but I do think that they're working on a move here, because I've gotten the sense, and I haven't heard this directly, but this has been more grapevine stuff, is that I feel like Danny Briere believes that Carter Hart being moved can really put this rebuild into overdrive. And you look at what he brought in for an Ivan Provorov, who's had, like 2 back-to-back bad seasons and then like a decent one this year. And he was able to bring in a pretty decent haul. And you could now imagine what a Carter Hart could bring. And, I've discussed this a bit over the last day or so, but you could potentially see the Flyers, if they play their cards right here, maybe in 2024, 2025, coming out of this thing, not being ready to contend for a cup or anything, but if you load up on enough draft picks in 2023 and you, let's say, bring in enough good prospects, along with whoever else you're drafting to supplement guys like Cutter Gauthier, whoever the 7th overall pick ends up being this year. I mean, maybe you're not as far as you once thought. And maybe after 3 years of rebuilding, if we're counting this year as a rebuild, as in 2022, 2023, maybe the Flyers in 24-25 could be a playoff team of sorts and really start to make some noise.
Yeah, it's not impossible. I mean, it's not exactly the same situation. But if you look at that key juncture for the Dallas Stars, when right before Ben, he had a good year this year, but he was declining. Sagan was injured a lot, declining, and they had this incredible draft in 2017. Who did they pick up? They pick up was it Johnston, Robertson, Ottinger?
It was Robertson, Ottinger, and Heiskanen. Yeah,
Heiskanen, right. And Wyatt Johnston's like later. So I stand corrected there. But that was a turning point for them to become kind of retool. The Flyers already have like a really productive, promising bottom 6 group. They just need guys to layer up on the top of the draft and to get the top level talent on their forward core and defense. Dan?
Yeah, the Carter Hart stuff's interesting, and I dropped out a little bit there while Anthony was talking. I heard some of the teams he was mentioning. I was just going to quickly go through them. So, yeah, Toronto's really interesting. I think, to Anthony's point, I feel like the organization is going to have a tough discussion internally when it comes to Hart, because I think there is a large portion of the fan base that would be really turned off if they traded him. You know, there was so much emphasis put on the fact that this franchise couldn't get a quote-unquote franchise goalie, and now we finally have a guy who looks like he could be one. He's Canadian. He's a good-looking kid. People like it. People tend to really like him, right? It would be a difficult sell, I feel like, moving on from him, even though I've been on record over the last few years as saying that I think it's the type of risk that a team in this position has to take if they really want to turn things around, because there is the possibility that Samuel Ersson or Alexei Kolosov, who's in Russia, is one of the best young goalies in Russia, could be just as good as Carter Hart. So if you can get assets for him and you have a young goalie that could be just as good as him, I think it's a risk you have to take. But as Anthony was saying, because of all the factors surrounding him, I think you would have to get a big return. So Toronto, you know, they've got the 28th overall pick in the draft. I think they'd have to add in one of their top prospects, which would be either Matthew Nyes or maybe Nick Robertson. Who's been injury. Yeah. He's been really injury prone though, so that's a question mark, right? And then they've got Fraser Minton is like a pretty good center prospect, but you know, it's a question of, is that going to be enough, right? A late first round pick and Matthew Nyes, however you pronounce it, would probably be, you know, an acceptable package. Who knows if Toronto would want to do that? Ottawa, I just don't think Ottawa has the pieces to make the trade. As Anthony said, they don't have a first or second round pick this year. Quite honestly, their prospect pool is not very good. So it would have to be someone off their roster. And
because they've already graduated, Dan? Like all their big time is their prospect pool not very good because all their bigger prospects have already graduated to the main roster?
Yeah, I would say that's probably fairly accurate. But I mean, you look at their prospect pool and it's just, they don't really have anyone that's, for example, they don't have anyone near the level of like the Toronto guys that I mentioned, even Fraser Minton, the third best guy in the Toronto system. They don't have anyone on the level of, because they've graduated, you know, their high draft picks, Brady Tkachuk, Tim Stützle, those guys have graduated. They traded their pick last year for Alex DeBrincat. I don't think the Flyers will probably want to trade Hart for DeBrincat because DeBrincat's in a similar situation as Konechny is, of course, sort of the same type of player. So I just don't know if – I'm sure that Jake Sanderson, right, really good young defenseman for the Senators would probably get the deal done for Hart or something like that. But I just can't imagine them wanting to trade him. But that could be a potential, right? Montreal is definitely really interesting, especially if you could find a way to leverage Hart and get the 5th overall pick. I mean, imagine if you could trade number 22 and Hart and get number 5 and potentially get a franchise center like Carlson. I don't love Will Smith, but he probably does fit in pretty well with all the high volume shooters that they're amassing on this team. Cutter Gauthier, Tyson Forster, a guy like Will Smith probably would fit in. So imagine if you had picks 5 and 7, right? that could be an enticing way to go for Hart. It'll be interesting to see. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of like where I am with the teams that Anthony was talking about with Hart. But again, this is why, Briere's coming up with these deals that no one else is thinking of. So I'm sure there's stuff out there that we're not even thinking of, 3-way deals that he's maybe working on. I was curious, Anthony, did you hear anything about, because again, I would have figured maybe that if Columbus had real interest in Kevin Hayes, that they might have figured out a way to make him part of this deal. Did you hear anything about that component?
The only thing that I kind of heard, and a lot of my big sources haven't been able to jump on a phone call the last 24 hours or so for obvious reasons. All hell's breaking loose. And the Flyers are also doing their prospect interviews this week. So all that was going down yesterday while they're still doing interviews for guys that they could potentially take the 7th overall pick with. But one thing I did hear was that it's not that they're not interested in Hayes, Columbus. It's more the fact that because there was the third team involved and because LA wanted to start negotiating with Gavrikov, there was more of an urgency to get this deal done. And then they could kind of park the Hayes stuff at the door. Because let's be honest here, like, you don't have a big list of teams banging down the door for Kevin Hayes. Like, the Flyers and the Jackets could probably take that very, very slow. And I do think that there's probably a discussion going on with the Flyers of, do you want to prioritize more a return by retaining less, or prioritize eating, or let's say prioritize a return by eating more? Like, let's say you could get more in the way of assets if you eat, let's say, $3 million plus, or do you want to retain less money but get less in the way of return? So I think that's probably a discussion they have to have. I think you could make the case for both arguments. Maybe if you could get somewhere in the 3rd round pick, maybe you go closer to eating $3 million or whatsoever. But I still think that I think in some form of fashion, Kevin Hayes won't be here next year, just because I do think the Flyers really want to prioritize giving guys opportunities, younger players. I've heard that a lot. And that's why I'm of the belief now that Tony DeAngelo won't be here one way or the other. Because I do think, and Briere kind of alluded to this in his media availability yesterday, they want to give their young players playing time here. And the addition of Sean Walker, I think he just fits in more stylistically for the Flyers. Like, if you want to play Igor Zamula with a right shot defenseman, you probably want more of a consistent defensive guy in Walker than a wild card like DeAngelo. And obviously you have the personality stuff as well. So I do think that Hayes and also Tony DeAngelo are two guys that probably won't be here when all the dust settles.
Let me just throw another name in, because Anthony and I were kind of going back and forth. And again, I'm just spitballing here. I would keep my eye on Steve Yzerman in Detroit. When you think about it, they have 2 number 1 picks. I think they have the number 9 and the number 17. They have an A-rated prospect pool. Guys like Carter Mazur, Sebastian Cossa is their top prospect, but he took a little bit of a dip last year, and he had to go be demoted to the ECHL. And then you have another higher prospect, Marco Kasper, a very highly rated prospect, a center. That might be a little bit too rich for a deal like this, but Detroit is in a situation. They thought they were ready to go last year and start really becoming a playoff team, and they had to put that off. So one of the provisos, and Anthony, you could chime in here, when they signed Dylan Larkin, I think part of it was like, we really are starting to crank this thing up. It would kind of make sense. And again, this is not based on any chatter or information. This is just me trying to put 2 and 2 together and look at trade prospects for Carter Hart.
No, I think it makes perfect sense. And to your point, and Dan, you could speak to this as well. I think it was 2021 when they took Sebastian Cossa and they passed on Jesper Wallstedt. And Jesper Wallstedt had an incredible season in Iowa in the Wild system. So obviously that was kind of like an egg that blew up in their face. They took a chance on Nedeljkovic. I don't think he's coming back. They kind of had a bridge deal with Ville Husso, who, I think is okay, but I don't know if that's the guy you want to hitch your wagon to long-term here. And who knows how long it's going to take Costa to be ready, and how good is he going to be when the dust settles. So, I mean, I think that would make sense for Hart. Obviously, you have a team that has draft capital, to your point, with 3 second-round picks, 2 first-round picks in each of the next 2 years. And they've drafted a lot in the last several years. So, I mean, that's a team that could also afford to part with some draft picks based on how much that they've drafted over the last couple of years under Steve Yzerman. I also wonder about them being a team for Tony DeAngelo as well. I mean, DeAngelo, like, we could talk about, like, and he's obviously major secondary to a guy like Carter Hart for obvious reasons. But I mean, like, DeAngelo, and we all know his defensive struggles. We all know that he could be a bit of an issue behind the scenes, but he still is a guy that put up 46 points in 70 games. And he still is a guy that, you know, is a year removed from having a really elite offensive season and just an overall very good season with the Carolina Hurricanes. And he's that ever-coveted right-shot defenseman that teams will always knock themselves over for and convince themselves are worth more than they are. And, you know, you look at the free agent crop this year on the right side. If you're, let's say, the Detroit Red Wings, who I think they only have one right-shot guy and Moritz Seider, would you rather pay 5 or 6 year contract to a guy like Dumba or Severson, or would you rather part with a mid-round draft pick to bring in a guy like Tony DeAngelo who's on that 1 year contract? So obviously Hart makes sense in Detroit, and I think you can make the case he makes sense for a lot of teams. But I also think that Tony DeAngelo might have more landing spots than we may have originally thought.
So Detroit is interesting because, as Isaiah mentioned, they have picks 9 and 17. However, they also have 3 picks in a row in the second round, and they're early. They have the 41st, 42nd, and 43rd picks in the second round, which, by the way, like, I love the Briere's creativity in making this trade. I think it's great. But we shouldn't completely ignore the fact that because of what Chuck Fletcher did, there are still teams that are in much better draft shape than the Flyers are this year, who are in rebuilding phases. The Red Wings, as we mentioned, have 2 first-round picks and 3 second-round picks. The St. Louis Blues have 3 first-round picks, 10, 25, and 29. They don't have any second-round picks. But it's great that the Flyers are adding draft picks back, but it's sort of it's a little bit depressing that even though, you know, we had to trade Ivan Provorov and we're adding picks, we're still not in as good of a spot, as some of these other teams that are even further advanced in the rebuild. For Detroit, first of all, Sebastian Cossa, I still think that they have extremely high hopes for him. I wouldn't view the fact that he was in the ECHL. I think bigger goalies take a lot longer to develop. He really started playing better at the end of last season. Yes, they took him ahead of Wallstedt, and right now, Jesper Wallstedt and Dustin Wolf for the Calgary Flames are far and away the two most highly touted goalie prospects in the league, I would say. But Cossa is still a top 5 goalie prospect in the league. Like, there are not many scouts that, like, because of him being in the ECHL and whatnot, are giving up on him. So I'm not sure that they would necessarily want to be trading for Carter Hart. The guy that I think that would make the most sense in Detroit is Travis Konechny. Like, if the Flyers decide they want to trade Travis Konechny, I think that there's 2 teams that make a ton of sense, and it's Detroit and it's St. Louis, because both of those are teams that are trying to have somewhat quicker turnarounds. They both have a ton of draft capital. And so I think just as interesting as Hart is going to be Konechny, because also he's clearly one of Tortorella's favorites. So Briere yesterday signaled that he's in on this rebuild. He traded away Provorov. Hart's going to be interesting, but Konechny's a guy that I think that if they want to trade him, Detroit or St. Louis would be perfect. I don't know if we could get the number 9 pick from Detroit or the number 10 pick from St. Louis, but Detroit's got 17. St. Louis has got 25. We could try and get, 17 and 41 from Detroit or something like that. I don't know. That's just going to be another interesting one to see if the Flyers' appetite for moving on from Konechny. Because the other thing, and maybe Anthony can talk to this, is that it seemed like Ivan Provorov didn't want to be here through a rebuild. It seems like from the stuff I've been hearing that Carter Hart I don't know, but it sounds, I haven't heard much in the way of people saying Carter Hart wants to be here. He wants to be in Philadelphia. I feel like Travis Konechny is a guy who wants to be in Philadelphia. And so that's what also kind of makes that one interesting. So I don't know, Anthony, do you have any insight on that one? Or
Yeah, like I think you're bang on with that in terms of Konechny, because and let's be honest here, John Tortorella has a big say in what's going on. Like in his media availability yesterday, Briere literally said he consulted John Tortorella on this deal, in addition to Hilferty and Jones and analytics department, whatever, pro scouting. And I think that Travis Konechny is a big John Tortorella guy. So I feel like they're going to almost make it like you have to knock our socks off to get Travis Konechny away from us. But I don't think he's untouchable by any means. But I do think that there is a value to keeping some veterans around in a rebuild. And I do think that, let's say, if you look at the Hextall quasi-rebuild, retool, whatever you want to call it, I think the defense that was so highly touted in, let's say, 2016-17 flopped as hard as they did because you didn't have veterans to play with them. Like, I remember 17-18 when I first started working for the fourth period, I was so excited to see a defense of, Provorov and Haig and Sanheim and Gostisbehere, but you had no good veterans to play with. Like, you had Sanheim playing with Gudis, and you had Provorov with McDonald, Haig, and Sanheim and Gostisbehere playing together. And I think that's what really hurt their development. And I think that if you look at the Flyers up front, yes, you have guys like Lawton, you have guys like Couturier, you have guys like Atkinson, but who's the one veteran who is a top 6/top line player? And that's Travis Konechny. And maybe there's a value there to keeping Travis Konechny around if you want to, keep Morgan Frost playing as their 1C, which I think at this point he is their 1C going forward until a Gauthier or another prospect comes in and maybe bumps him down. If Cutter Gauthier comes up, if let's say you draft, just for argument's sake, a Zach Benson, there's probably more of a value playing them with a Travis Konechny as opposed to another young guy trying to find his way in maybe a Forster, or if you want to count him as a young guy, Owen Tippett. So I do think Konechny wants to be here. And I also think because of his level of play, and also at this point, somewhat being a veteran, it does make a lot of sense to replace a guy like Konechny, because you also then have to account for the cost for replacement. Now, of course, they're very deep at right wing. You could drop Forster in there. You could drop Tippett in there. But let's say you move on from Konechny and you have a top 6 of, let's say, Farabee, Frost, Tippett, Cates,
Couturier.
Forster, Couturier. I mean, who knows what Couturier is going to be, but like, what level of offense is Couturier going to bring you? And I think that Konechny, being a veteran and also having a high level of offense, along with having a good attitude throughout this whole thing, is something that maybe they're considering as well.
Let me ask you, is there any other team that has come up? I know in the past Carolina was mentioned as far as Kevin Hayes.
Yeah, so I mean, it really seems like Columbus makes sense, because I think there's pressure from Johnny Gaudreau from, onto their management. Like, I think that they could probably find a deal to make Hayes work somewhere. But I think Columbus has pressure from their best player, who they just committed 7 years to, and they're best friends in that whole thing. And you're bringing in a coach like Mike Babcock now, who has always been a guy who prefers his veterans. I think that's fair to say. So, and I think that Kevin Hayes has always done well with coaches who prefer veterans. And AV is a perfect example of that. Like, AV is a guy who was always a veterans coach in Vancouver and in New York. And then when he came to Philadelphia that first 2 years, I mean, Kevin Hayes had a good playoff performance. He had a very good inaugural season in Philadelphia. So maybe he's a guy that would work well under Mike Babcock. So I think that Columbus is the team. Could the Flyers find another team to take him? I mean, Carolina is interesting. I've also thought about Carolina for Konechny as well, because obviously they could use some more offensive punch. And I don't think beyond just Barry Kotkaniemi, I don't think they have anybody signed beyond 2024, forward-wise, that is. Even Colorado, I've thought about for Kevin Hayes, because they haven't been able to replace a Nazem Kadri. JT Comfort didn't really work out as their second-line center this year. But I mean, I'm sure
if Bergeron retires, I mean, that's
that's another good option as well. I just think that that the Blue Jackets rather would make more sense because they have a pressure from their best player. So maybe they'd be more apt to do some wiggling in terms of what the return could be or what the retention on salary could be, because now they're also pushing some chips in the middle here. So I think they always have a pressure to be very good next year. And this is not to say that Kevin Hayes is like the cherry on top and the thing that's going to push you over the edge. But if it's going to make your best player happy, maybe you have more of an incentive to do it.
Yeah, and he's 30 years old now. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, I know. Just because they're looking at the Columbus roster, they do have a need for center. A 2C would be nice for them. Maybe he'd be the 1C there with Gaudreau, but they have a good young team. They've got Kent Johnson. They've got probably David Jiricek will probably be up in the NHL next season. Kirill Marchenko is a really good young winger. They've got Cole Sillinger, kind of started off really good and tailed off a little bit, but he's another really good. What's that?
Bachvist.
Yeah, right, exactly. They've got a good young squad. So, and they bring in Babcock. I'm sure they are hoping to be a playoff team next year. So yeah, Hayes does just looking at the roster, it does seem to make a lot of sense. I wonder, you wonder again, they've got draft capital wise, they have 2 third-round picks, so that could be a potential target. It's funny seeing the wildly differing opinions on Twitter of how people value Kevin Hayes and what they think the Flyers are going to get back. I just can't imagine it's going to be that much, but they also have some cap space. So Columbus.
Yeah. And I do think kind of just shifting gears here is like, you see that the Flyers clearly want to prioritize their young defensemen, right? They want to give Zamula a chance. They want to give Adert a chance. And this is contract aside, obviously, because obviously the Sanheim deal and the Ristolainen contracts aren't ideal for where the Flyers were at organizationally. But, I was kind of going through a depth chart here, and assuming DeAngelo does get moved, if you could have something, obviously this isn't like a cup defensive core, but given what they're trying to do next year, if you could have a defense core of York, Ristolainen, Sanheim, Adert, Zamula, and Sean Walker, I mean, I do think that at least from an on-ice perspective, and you take the contracts away and maybe the assets you gave up for Ristolainen away, it does kind of shake out well that, like, at least you have some seasoned veterans to play with each of these guys on their strong side. Like, Sanheim's probably a good partner for Ronnie Adert. Sean Walker is a good ideal partner on a third pair for Zamula. York and Ristolainen played well together last year. I think that was arguably their most consistent pair at times. So, I mean, I at least, again, contracts aside, assets aside, at least from an on-paper perspective going in, having guys like Sanheim and Ristolainen and now a Sean Walker more in the shorter term will help ease in some of these younger defensemen that they clearly want to give playing time next year.
Yeah, and Sean Walker is kind of like a combo Justin Braun, like you were saying, and there's also some Nick Seeler in his game as well. I was just going to ask whether Nick Seeler now becomes maybe expendable, or do they want to keep him around as like this spare defenseman?
I would imagine you're going to see kind of Seeler and Walker battle it out here. Like, obviously, we know John Tortorella is a fan of Nick Seeler. He played, and he did, by all accounts, he had a very good year last year, given for what you were expecting of him. And I think that you do want a veteran as your number 7, whether it is Walker, whether it is Seeler. Like, I just don't see the point of, let's say, you move on from Nick Seeler and then you have, I don't know, take your pick, Helgi Grant sitting as your number 7, something like that. Like, I think the ideal setup is what they have right now is either a Seeler or a Walker as your number 7. And I think that towards the draft, the trade deadline rather next year, those are guys that are going to inherently have more value on those expiring deals. Like, you got a 3rd round pick for Justin Braun in 2022. If you could get something like that again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, that kind of turns the Provorov deal into a 4 draft pick type of return. And to Dan's point about like the value, a lot of fans, obviously, because they've had to sit through the last 3 seasons or whatever, they just think that no player has value. And Provorov was a guy like that too. Like when I said they were looking for Chychrun and Ekholm type returns, a lot of people laughed and, oh, Provorov's garbage. He's this, he's that. But I do think what we saw is that even though these players haven't succeeded in Philadelphia, there are still value to these guys. And, Kevin Hayes, like, is he $7 million player? No, of course not. Would he have been if the cap would have gone up over 90 million if it wasn't for COVID? Maybe. But with the flat cap, he isn't that. But he still is a 50-point centerman. Even a bad year this year, he still put up, 55 points or whatever it was. And 50-point centermen are tough to come by. Like, go look at the crop this year. I think the best center on the market, if you're not counting like Bergeron, I guess it's Ryan O'Reilly, but from a younger perspective, maybe it's JT Compher, who didn't really do a whole lot in Colorado this year. So, I mean, I do think there's value for Kevin Hayes on the trade market. I really just think it's how much the Flyers are willing to retain. I know that they feel him at $5 million is fair, but maybe other teams are going to try and squeeze them other than the Blue Jackets and say, well, we want him at $4 million. And let's be honest, Kevin Hayes at $4 million, I think would be a fairly fair ticket.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan?
I was curious. I'm wondering how much of a couple things. Obviously the Flyers are going to be worse with Provorov. Do we think that there's a sort of a concerted effort to tank, for lack of a better word, in terms of, I think they're obviously trying to gain assets for the rebuild, but a byproduct of that is that this team certainly looks like it's not going to be quite as good next season. Do we think that's part of the overall strategy of what's going on here, to not be as good next season, to have a better chance at getting a top 3 pick?
I think I think next year they view it as another year in which they could evaluate what they have, because there aren't a lot of graduations from the juniors and the NCAA into the professional. Like, I think you have Ethan Sampson and J.R. Avon as like the only relatively significant graduations that will make their presence felt in the AHL. So I think for them, based on discussions I've had, is that they view it as one more year to have some of their other prospects season up. You have Gauthier, you have whoever they're going to draft 7th overall this year. I think they even have some good kids that they took last year. Devin Kaplan's one of them. I think he's at Boston College as well. And there's the other kid, Hunter something. I forgot his name. But
yeah, I think
anyway,
Kaplan's at Boston University, I think.
Yeah, he's at BU.
Oh yeah, okay, that's it. I always mix those two up. But so I think that they think that this year their bigger prospects aren't going to be ready, specifically Cutter Gauthier, and they have a chance here to still evaluate what they have in guys like Allison, what they have in guys like Lazinski. I mean, I think that they're both going to get another crack at it just because of the lack of graduations. But this is pretty much it for guys like Lazinski and Allison. They're not young guys anymore. They're borderline veterans. I think the clock is even ticking on a guy like Igor Zamula. Like, you have Andre pushing, you have whoever else you have in your roster, in your system. So, and then Morgan Frost, I think, did enough this year to be a part of the solution long-term, but depending on what kind of contract he gets, I mean, all of a sudden the Flyers aren't completely a waste baron at center ice. You have Couturier coming back, you have Noah Cates, you have Denway. Ideally, they want Gauthier to be a center. You also have a guy like Owen Tippett. So I think it just, for them, maybe they're not intentionally trying to tank, but based on what else they're trying to do, the tank also makes sense. If in my opinion, that's how I see it. And like you said, Dan, they've started accumulating draft picks for next year. You have 2 first-round picks. You have 2 second-round picks. So it kind of seems like that's going to be a byproduct, is them tanking because of the other stuff they're looking to accomplish.
Yeah,
Isaiah, what do you think?
I think it's like, well, let's get some value. Let's collect some assets and see what happens. And if it just so happens about halfway through the year that it looks like a tank could advance their program, then I think they would revert to that. But I don't think they're purposely doing what they can to strip bare, because that's what they'd have to do. If they're tanking, they're getting rid of Konechny, and they're only keeping the contracts they couldn't get rid of anyway. Guys like Atkinson and Couturier and a couple others. So I would think that it's like, let's see what happens. And if need be, then we're going to position ourselves to officially tank.
And look, we're a long way off from next season, right?
Yeah.
But looking at the teams picking in the top 10 this year, okay, Chicago's getting Connor Bedard, right? You've got to think that even if he struggles a little bit at the NHL level, that they're going to be probably markedly better next season than they are this year. With Bedard, you would think, right, if he's a generational player. Anaheim, I'm surprised, I was kind of surprised they finished where they did this year. Yeah. Let's say they add Adam Fantilli. I'm guessing that he will turn pro, and they should rebound a little bit. Anaheim should. Columbus, who's picking third, is clearly a team that wants to be better next year. I would think would almost assuredly be better than the Flyers. So I'm looking at this as I look at the teams here, and I feel like San Jose, Arizona, and the Flyers are almost right now, if you were going to predict it, clearly the three worst teams in the NHL going into next season.
But here's the thing. Look what happened with Columbus. Nobody thought they would be where they're at, So injuries can play.
But I mean, does that sound accurate? I mean, I look at the NHL right now and the directions that all these teams are headed, and it's hard for me to believe that, San Jose, Arizona, and the Flyers aren't going to be markedly worse than every other team in the league. I don't know. Am I off base?
No, I don't think so. I think that's accurate. Who's the wonder kid for next year? Is it Celebrini?
Yeah, Macklin Celebrini, Cole Yzerman. Things will change, but those are kind of the two guys right now. There's a ton of really good right-handed defensemen in the draft next year. Next year's draft is very defense heavy. Yzerman and, by the way, spelled differently and no relation to Steve Yzerman, but Yzerman and Celebrini are both forwards. But aside from them, it's a very defense heavy draft. So it's interesting. Maybe I'll throw that out there on Twitter to see what people think. I mean, aside from those three teams, I think, Montreal should be a lot better next year, you would think. I don't know.
Yeah. And another reason for the Flyers not to just, draft Reinbacher because, oh my God, we got to get a defenseman. Just pick the best player. If they really think it's Reinbacher, great, but don't pass Zach Benson or somebody like that.
I don't think it's going to, I think they're going forward. I've heard Leonard. I think Will Smith is their guy, but I don't think he's going to make it past San Jose or Montreal. I think Will Smith and Dvorsky are going to go like 4 or 5, and then my guess. I've heard Michkov is slipping. My guess is he doesn't get by Arizona because Arizona, based on how many draft picks they had last year, and they have, I think, the 11th overall this year. They have Ottawa's pick. I think that they could afford to take that semi-risk on Michkov. And I do think that the Flyers have liked Oliver Bonk, which falls in that 20-ish range. So I think what they've done here with that 22nd overall pick is that you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. Take the guy with the high upside. I think that I think Zach Benson, and Dan can speak to this better than me. I think he's a very high upside pick. Obviously on the smaller side, but he is all about upside and point producing. More of a left wing, but still, I mean, I don't think the center ice position is as grim as it once was, especially if Gauthier develops as that. And then you could maybe get a defenseman in Bonk, a right shot defenseman with the second first round pick you have.
Yeah.
I'm preparing for them to take Ryan Leonard. I like Ryan Leonard a lot, by the way. He's just such the prototypical Flyers type of pick.
Yeah.
He's built out of the Cutter Gauthier, Matthew Tkachuk type of mold, and he's a big game player. He has one of the highest floors of the guys who will get taken between 5 to 10, and he also has an extremely high ceiling. I would just, we've got Danny Briere, who is an undersized player who is very talented, who took a little bit of a while to develop, which is sort of why I would love to see them take a chance on a guy like Benson.
Yeah.
But, the more I read, the more I hear, I think Benson has a real chance of slipping on draft day just because of his size. Sort of a little bit like Matthew Savoy did last year, who's a teammate of Benson's. Yeah, but I'm just sort of I'm just sort of, if they stay at 7, I think it's very likely that they'll end up with Ryan Leonard, although a bunch of draft pundits have Leonard going ahead of them in that spot. It's going to be very fascinating to see what happens. The Will Smith stuff, I will be annoyed if they trade up to take Will Smith, just because I wouldn't take him at 7. I just have some concerns about him, but I could be completely wrong. So that will annoy me. If they traded up to get Leo Carlsson, I would love it. He would be a great fit.
I think he's going through to Columbus.
There's been a lot of noise Columbus with Will Smith, but you're hearing Carlsson.
I just think that in some like Will Smith is rising. I just think that 3 to 5 is going to be in some fashion Smith, Carlsson, Dvorsky, something in there. And it's going to depend on Michkov, right? Like maybe for me, it's Arizona. That's the wild card with Michkov, because I think if you're Arizona, you take that chance because you took Cooley last year. You took Geeky last year. You have the 11th overall pick this year. You can afford to take that risk. But I do agree with you on Ryan Leonard. I know the Flyers feel like he could be a center. I spoke to a head scout from another NHL team, and he said he's more likely to be a right wing, but he could be a center as well. But I do think, Dan, you're really right on that with them liking Leonard. And at this point, if I had to handicap it, I think that Leonard would be the type of guy that they would go for. Me saying Benson, I think that's just where I'm leaning. And I think, Dan, you said the same thing, just because I get the whole character stuff. Yes, the center stuff, but you kind of did that with Gauthier last year. And I still do think Gauthier has a chance to be the better pick in time. And I've heard a lot of people say that he was the right pick and the attitude, best interview, all this from other teams, that is. But I think that you also at some point have to take that high upside pick. And you see and obviously it's not apples to apples in the US developmental system and the WHL. Of course it isn't. But you see Benson, I think he has 98 points in 60 games. Obviously the size is a bit of concern, but you sometimes have to take those high risk picks. And I think the Flyers have actually addressed their size in recent years in the draft. And obviously Gauthier, Kaplan last year, Tippett isn't a slouch by any stretch. So, I mean, if they're both available, and obviously I'm not a huge prospect guy, but I would like Benson just because I like the offensive upside. But like Dan said, I think it might be Leonard because he has a better shot to be a center and is more of a Flyers mold.
Yeah, I mean, at some point they're going to have to. As I mentioned, they've got a lot of shoot first guys, right? Cutter Gauthier, I mean, he is a prolific shooter. If you watch the World Championships, first of all, he had an unbelievable World Championships. He was in the same category as an under 20-year-old guy as players like Crosby, Stamkos, in terms of the production that he had against older players at that World Championships. But he is a high volume shooter. Owen Tippett is a high volume shooter. Tyson Forster is a high volume shooter. At some point, they're going to have to start filling in with playmakers. Morgan Frost obviously has a lot of upside as a big time playmaker. He's going to have to take another step forward next year. But it's another reason why Will Smith would probably be a good fit here, and Leo Carlsson also. But I think Benson could ultimately play center, and he's a phenomenal playmaker. So just another reason why he would kind of be a good fit. And Oliver Moore, who's a guy I really liked at the beginning, he's probably more likely to go in the 10 to 15 range. He's the fastest player in the draft. He's not quite as heady from a playmaking perspective as some of these other guys are, but he's got that upside where he has so much speed that just imagine him creating space for shooters like Forster, like Gauthier, and that's could be an exciting thing to think about. But I think the fact that the Flyers traded for 22, they could take a defenseman there, as Anthony mentioned, but it may increase the chances they take a guy like a Ryan Leonard at 7, because they might feel like they can take a super high upside forward at 22. There's a lot of guys like that in the draft this year who are not as prolific as Benson was this year, but have kind of similar type of profiles. But Benson he's a high character guy, really good playmaker, really good skater. We'll see. It's going to be exciting. I'm just happy they have another pick in the first round. It'll make it a little more entertaining.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the way I look at it, if Mishkov's there, I'm going for Mishkov. If
You would
not,
take
then
that risk?
I'm going. Yeah, yeah, he's like a near generational level of talent, at least offensively. He was rated in between Malkin and Ovechkin. It's like in terms of potential. So I'm not passing on that. But I love Benson. I think that he would be excellent. And then I would go Leonard. Leonard, this is from Grant McCagg passing along because they're having a combine now. Hearing how physically impressive Ryan Leonard is, built like a linebacker with huge neck and legs. A genetic freak is how one combine attendee described him. So there's a lot to like with Ryan Leonard too.
Yeah. No,
Sounds like Cutter Gauthier last year, right?
Yeah.
The Flyers kind of fell in love with Gauthier at the combine because of how confident he was, how physically advanced he was. Him and Ryan Leonard are really built out of the same mold, I think.
Yeah.
they're cut from
Leonard
the
is a
same
better
cloth.
playmaker than Gauthier, and Leonard's a really good shooter, but Gauthier is just a sublime shooter, and he loves shooting. Leonard's a little bit more of a playmaker, but
And
I think
guess
Leonard's
there's
got a
some
little
more,
higher playmaking.
and there's
upside.
some more flexibility, I guess, because I guess whether it's Benson or it's Leonard or if Dvorsky slips, your idea is that whoever you pick this year and Gauthier are going to make up 2/3 of your top line going forward. And maybe in their mind, they're saying, you set yourself up with Leonard, who could be a center or a right wing, and you set yourself up with Gauthier, who could be a left wing or a center, a right shot and a left shot. So there's more flexibility there, as opposed to Benson, I think he's more of a left wing, but as Dan said, the way he plays can maybe lend itself to being more of a center type.
He's the best IQ among all the people you mentioned, from what I understand. And
Is he kind of like a Mitch Marner type of player?
Benson, yeah, I think he's a really good skater. He's a little bit like a Marner, but he gets more physically involved than Marner. Benson doesn't back down. Like, he'll get involved physically. He's a really fun player. But I do see a lot of scouts that have him rated lower and might, talk about him slipping a little bit. So I just question whether or not, based on that. I mean, last year, a lot of scouts had Gauthier rising late. You heard noise with the Flyers. I just don't get the sense that Benson is their guy, but yeah, I could be wrong.
Yeah. So the last thing, Dan, just one before we wrap up with you, because I know you got some other obligations yourself. The Flyers made some moves that we all knew were kind of coming, and some that we didn't see coming. With Alan McCauley, Riley Armstrong becomes a director of player personnel, and Nick Schultz, now an assistant player development director. Shel Samuelson, John Riley, and Mike O'Connell have been let go. And this speaks to the Flyers' attempt to repair their development system, which has been heavily criticized.
Yeah, I think we're seeing Danny Briere's fingerprints on some of these moves that are happening. The Flyers have an emphasis on trying to improve their player development. So time will tell if it's good or bad. But if Briere is as good of a evaluator of personnel off the ice as he seemingly was able to orchestrate this trade, I think that hopefully it's a good portent. But yeah, it's basically Briere's putting his fingerprints on the organization. They finally will have someone that's sort of dedicated to the Phantoms. Brent Flair, who is the assistant GM, had previously been sort of tasked with overseeing the Phantoms. Now they've got a kind of a split of duties. I think the fact that Flair is still here is important. It shows that they've got some confidence in him. I don't think they would have wanted to get rid of their head of scouting right before the draft. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, just some moves that we'll kind of have to wait and see how they pan out. A little sad to see Shel Samuelson leaving the organization. Obviously, he was a good Flyer. But, I have no idea how he was as a scout and or player development kind of guy.
Yeah. So obviously they took their feedback on that, and they just felt like, well, maybe it's just time for a change. And it has been a big problem. It's one of the things that people cite in the Hextall era, which, Chuck Fletcher was unable to repair despite whatever efforts he made. So we'll have to go from there. So Dan, where can people find you on social media?
Folks can find me at dsilver88 on Twitter. And you can find, I wrote an article about options available for the Flyers at number 7. You can find that article at phillyisflyer.com. It's either .com or .net. I don't know. You can figure it out. But yeah, so that's where you can find me.
Fantastic. So on one last thing before you go, what's the next thing the Flyers are going to do that makes news? I tease that one out. Just off the top of your head, your gut feeling, not any chatter or anything like that. You think Carter Hart is going to get traded, or do you think something else is going to happen?
Who's going to be the next guy to go? So our options are D'Angelo, Hayes, Hart, and Konechny. I'm not sure. I don't know who's going to be the next guy to go. It's hard to tell. A lot of it's going to happen around the draft, I think, which is June 28th. So we've got about 3 weeks before that happens. But no, I'll say Tony D'Angelo will be the next domino to drop. So.
Okay, cool. All right, man. We'll catch you next show.
Sounds good. Have a good one.
All right, man. Take care. And we are back with Anthony. You had to take that radio hit, Anthony. You're a star.
Yeah, it's been a very busy 20 hours or so, but trying to fit everything in. You're my second podcast today. I did a podcast with Jay last night, and I did have to fulfill my commitment weekly with TSN 690.
Well, that's you're in demand. That's what you want. We were just talking about before Dan had to roll about the Flyers staff changes, and look, I couldn't tell you yay or nay whether these are going to be upgrades, but something had to be done from a development standpoint. And of course, you were first with a lot of this information. And is there any kind of like insider kind of scuttlebutt or talk about what drove these and what may be in the offing in that regard as well?
I just think that they wanted some new perspective. Obviously, Mike O'Connell was somewhat at a retirement age. I do also think that they didn't have a clear-cut director of player development. I think that O'Connell was by default the head guy with the senior advisor tag aside from player development. You bring in now Riley Armstrong, who I think did a good job with the Phantoms last year. Obviously more of a younger, maybe forward-thinking mind. And Nick Schultz, who I think has been a good soldier for this organization. Yep. In a lot of ways, obviously tagged in as an assistant coach in the wake of the Michel Therrien and Alain Vigneault firing. So he gets assistant of director of player development. And then you get Alan McCauley, who is going to being taken over for all intents and purposes. The Phantoms gets the AGM tag as well. Now they have 3 assistant GMs. I think the first time they've had that since John Paddock was an AGM and oversaw the Phantoms as well in the Paul Holmgren era. And I think that, maybe a bit too early to say this, but it feels like Alan McCauley is trending in the way of Briere's right-hand man, similar to what we saw with Brent Flahr to Chuck Fletcher. And I also think that in the case of Brent Flahr, it's a good thing for him because for a lot of times he was the GM in an unofficial capacity of the Phantoms, in addition to holding his AGM title, his EVP title, overseeing the amateur scouting. And I do think one of the things that they wanted to change from the Fletcher era was not overloading the plates of people. And now you've kind of seen them take some responsibility off of Brent Flahr. Maybe he could focus primarily on the amateur scouting. And I do think that for the most part, you could speak to this well, Isaiah, that Brent Flahr has done a passable, decent job in the draft department, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say so. There's more promise than there's been in recent years. We saw that the picks that were made earlier during the Hextall era, when we all got our hopes up, didn't pan out. Some of them were rushed, some of them weren't developed properly, and that's kind of being addressed now for the second or third time, depending on which regime you want to refer back to. So I would say Flahr has done a pretty good job. They have a look at that up close. They know what it looks like in the room when the scouts are all around the table and they're having their conversations. So obviously Danny's been in some of those conversations, and he saw how Brett comported himself and how he collaborated, if I could use that word, which is a big word, with buzzword with the Flyers these days, with his scouting staff. And the Flyers scouting staff has always been considered in the upper tier, or at least in the upper half of the league, depending on what perspective you're talking about. So we'll have to see it, and I think it continues to be something that's being evaluated. And I also think it's notable for Brent Flair that he is untethering himself from Chuck Fletcher. They've been joined at the hip for all these years, and now he's kind of striking out on his own, and we'll see what happens. We'll see how it turns out. We could be back here next year when the Flyers are making all these picks, and he could be gone because they're not really happy with the way things going. I think everything right now is being evaluated, and they're making moves.
Yeah, and obviously a lot has been talked about of Barry Hanrahan. I still keep hearing that he has the support of Danny Briere right now, but maybe there's some pressure above hockey operations that want Hanrahan gone. I obviously there's some blood on the hands of Barry Hanrahan. He's been running their cap since the Bobby Clark era as GM. But I do think one thing I've heard is that, let's see what Hanrahan could do with a forward-thinking GM who knows how to manage the cap. Because even a guy like Ron Hextall, who said he wanted to prioritize cleaning up the cap, and he did in a lot of ways, he still signed the Gostisbehere deal. He still signed the Voracek deal. He still signed the JVR deal. So, Hanrahan isn't the one deciding who gets what money. He just is the one deciding how to structure the contracts. So I've heard that maybe they want to see how he does under Danny Briere, and maybe a GM who isn't just trying to make the team better right away and is fully committed to a rebuild. But I still think maybe that's the one to watch. I think Brent Flair is safe, at least for the time being. Hanrahan, I feel like it's a 50-50. I've heard a lot of conflicting things on it. And obviously, Alan McCauley has seen his profile and responsibilities skyrocket, even going back to Chuck Fletcher when he was promoted to director of player personnel. Right.
So, he's not going anywhere. He's held in good stead right now. So I guess really with that, the next big event is, the next deal that they make until the draft. And I think right now, just to kind of sum it all up, I think Briere has created the conditions where there's going to be somewhat of a bidding war for Carter Hart. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I think so. I think that they've worked, like me and Dave said yesterday on Twitter, they're working on trying to get a deal together. I do think it's something they would prefer to do because they feel like it could really fast track this rebuild. I don't think it's something that they're committed to doing in any way, and I don't think that they'll budge on their price whatsoever. But I do think it is something of a bidding war. The three consistent teams I've heard is Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, as I mentioned earlier in the show. Obviously, you have some other intriguing destinations like Detroit, but they do have Sebastian Cossa. A lot of people have brought up Edmonton. I think in an ideal world, they would have liked that, but now they've hitched their wagon to not Jeff Skinner. Stuart Skinner and Jack Campbell. And I think they have over $7 million committed to both of them collectively for the foreseeable future. So that could complicate some things. There are obviously a few teams that would like it. Obviously the LA Kings, but now I don't think they have the draft capital to give up for Carter Hart unless they want to start maybe looking to move a Brandt Clark or a Quentin Byfield, which I don't think they want to do. So it's going to be interesting, and it's going to really, I think, incite a bidding war. I would look at those three Eastern Canadian teams as the ones who will probably make the biggest play for Carter Hart. And I don't want to say that it's definitive or it's imminent, but with all the smoke now that's coming out about Hart, and like I said on Jay's podcast yesterday, Stick to Hockey, I'm of the belief that there was an expectation from the Cal Peterson camp that Carter Hart was going to be moved. And Briere reiterated this in his media availability yesterday that he is going to give Peterson a chance to make the NHL right out of camp. If Carter Hart is here, I don't see how that's possible because I don't know, Isaiah, even if Cal Peterson technically outplays Sandstrom, are you going to risk losing Sandstrom on waivers just to have Peterson as the backup to Hart?
No, not at all. Not for $5 million. Not for, I love that contract because you can, like I said earlier, you can just waive them and no one's going to take them. And if someone does take him, great, you just lost $5 million. And you just increased the value of what you just traded for.
Exactly. So even if Peterson were to outplay Sandstrom marginally in camp, I'm still keeping Sandstrom. And I know the Flyers like Sandstrom as well. And look, is he going to be a starter in this league? Probably not. But I think he's proven to be that he's like is he any worse than Martin Jones or Brian Elliott at this juncture? Like, you might as well just, like, I think they like the talent in Sandstrom, and they rather just work with him for at least another year than give that job to a Cal Peterson.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a little bit of Stoley. I think he's a little bit actually more talented than Stolarz, but I think he's going to have a very similar career. He's going to be a backup. Yeah. And if he just gets a little bit more consistent and shows he could play like that odd game, like after not playing for like 15 games, he can come in because of an injury and do a 3 or 4 spot and give him reliable goaltending, then he'll carve out a career. And I think that's what the best he can hope for at this stage of the game. But you never know with goaltenders.
So I agree 100%. It's just, I don't like, so for Peterson to have a legit chance in camp, Hart can't be here because you're not waiving Sandstrom to make Peterson the backup. And Hart isn't, if Hart's here, like, he's obviously going to be on the roster. He's going to be probably the starter. So between Briere's comments, what I've heard about the agent, about what he said, and also them saying that they're working on a deal, I'm just of the belief right now that, like, it's more likely than not that Hart isn't here in maybe 4 to 5 weeks' time.
Yeah. No, that's the kind of feeling I have right now. I mean, you got the information. I'm kind of putting the pieces together, culling it all together, and I see the same thing. So it bears watching, man.
Yeah. And, like, if there's any indication what they got for Provorov, I mean, that would suggest they're going to get a haul. And, I talked about it on another podcast. Like, there's a solid possibility here that when all is said and done, you have 3 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, 2 third-round picks in this year's draft, in addition to whatever else they can pull together. So, I mean, if you have, what would that be? 7 draft picks in the first 3 rounds of this draft, that could really set yourself up nice. And that's why I think that this rebuild may not take as long as people think, because you also have some guys on your roster who are going to be here for the future, like a Farabee, a Tippett, Noah Cates, Frost, maybe, if he could string it together consistently. The back end with guys like Cam York, like Andre looks good. Like, a lot would depend on what happens at goaltending, whether Urson pushes through or Kolosov or Fedotov or whoever. But I think that's maybe the process of moving on from Hart, that they could really accelerate this thing. And in, let's say, a season and a half's time, they could be a playoff team and then start building their forth.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't have to be long. I mean, like I, mentioned Dallas before. I mean, that was a game changer for them. I think they probably saw that and had their own ideas about what a good draft can do in just a couple years. I mean, it never seems like the Flyers have the ability to make that kind of turnaround with draft picks. It always seems to take a real long time. But part of that is a function of the fact that they, except for Nolan Patrick, they really haven't been picking that high.
Yep. No, it's true. And, like, now you're going to have last year where you got a 5th overall. This year you got a 7th overall, but this year it's more of like a 2015 7th where like, I mean, you could maybe get a Mikko Rantanen type. Like, he went 8th overall that year or 9th overall. So, I mean, there's you may not get that generational superstar like a Bedard or a Fantilli or what have you. But, I mean, if you have Gauthier and Leonard or Benson or whoever they end up coming away with, like, if all things break like equally here, you could at least have the formation or a framework of what your top line could look like going forward. Yep.
And then it's just a matter of just getting that defenseman. Then it's going to be all out. And that could be next year. Next year is the big draft year for, like Dan was saying, for the defenseman. And I hope they have their eye on the big picture if they have this impulse to draft a guy like Reinbacher, which I think would just be a little too high. But I don't want to get too deep into that. We got to get rolling. So, Anthony, where can people find you on Twitter and social media? What you got coming up?
So obviously my handle is ADiMarco25. You can find my work at thefourthperiod.com. Obviously I still do the podcast with Jay, Stick to Hockey Live. Sparingly on Brotherly Pod. I did one this morning. I try and fit that in as much as I can, but it's more of like a bi-weekly thing at this point. And obviously a weekly, you can catch me on TSN 690. More in studio now. Today was over the phone because of how loaded my day and how loaded my plate has become. But yeah, so 690, Stick to Hockey Live, sparingly on Brotherly Pod, Fourth Period, all that. And sometimes right here on O&B Puck.
Thanks. Always great to have you on now. So, we're going to wrap it right there because we got a draft show coming up. It's either going to be the 19th or the 21st, depending on whether the finals go 7 games or not. But probably will be the 19th. And right now, if everything's hold to form, we're going to have 2 national experts comparing notes about what that first round is going to look like. And now it's more intriguing than ever. So you can catch us, by the way, again, at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck on Twitter. You can catch me, Isaiah, ISAIAH _520. Isaiah, don't forget the _520. And of course, you can catch Chef to the Left B, Chef to the Left B on Twitter. And hopefully he'll be with us for our next voyage. So until our next time, everybody, take care.